This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 29 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, July 16th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Graniteville section. The Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church held a sale on the church grounds on Thursday evening. Ice cream and homemade cakes and candies and popcorn was sold. Music was furnished by the Imperial Orchestra, and the lawn was brilliantly lighted with Japanese lanterns. The affair proved a great success both financially and socially. Those who attended the 8:45 Mass in St. Catherine's Church on Sunday morning were highly pleased with its singing as furnished by the Men's Cathedral Choir of Boston. Nothing like it has ever been heard here on any occasion, and the parishioners of St. Catherine's Church feel highly honored in having such eminent singers present in this little church. The pastor, Edward T. Schofield, thanked the young men sincerely for their kindness in being present and giving the members of his flock the opportunity of hearing good Catholic music by a first-class choir. Mr. and Mrs. O.A. Nelson of this village spent Sunday as guests of Mr. and Mrs. Fred Horn of Nashua at their summer camp on the bank of the Merrimack. Edward DiLorenzo cut his knee quite badly while at work at the H.E. Fletcher Quarry at Oak Hill on Monday morning, and he is now under the doctor's care. Charles Martell of South Framingham has been a recent visitor at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Matthew Downs of North Westford. The Downs lived just off of Dunstable Road, not too far from. In fact, I guess they lived in the old brick tavern that's at the corner of Dunstable Road and Groton Road. J.B. Riney, while at work at C.G. Sargent's shop on Monday, had a heavy casting fall on his left hand, breaking the index finger. Dr. William H. Sherman dressed the wound. The members of the Albert R. Schote Hose Company held a very interesting meeting in their rooms Monday night. Business of importance was transacted and plans formulated for a special event in the future. Each of the three villages in town, that is Ford's Village, Graniteville, and the center, Westford Center, had a hose company, each named after a different person, who generally somebody who was a senior fireman in the area. The next section is the Westford Center section. It seemed quite like former times last Sunday morning to have in the audience at the Congregational Church Mr. and Mrs. John P. Wright with Francis and Alice, and also Mr. and Mrs. William A. Perkins. Mr. and Mrs. Wright and children are spending a month at Miss Hildreth's log cabin on Prospect Hill. Mr. and Mrs. Perkins are guests of Mr. Bunce's Providence Farm, and later of Mr. and Mrs. Arthur E. Days. Elizabeth and Marion Perkins are spending the summer with the Chicago relatives. Mrs. Pauline Dole and Lillian Sutherland have been enjoying vacation days in Somerville. Mrs. H.N. Jocks and daughter Dorothy of Malden are visiting her parents, Mr. and Mrs. William Sutherland. Mrs. A.K. Francis, Miss Lizzie Howard, and Mrs. Helen and Dora Jones, all of Lunenburg, were guests at the Congregational Parsonage this week. Mrs. Mary E. Fletcher and daughter Nellie have been among the sick ones this week, and Miss Martha Hildreth of North Westford is caring for them. The regular midweek prayer service at the Congregational Church has been discontinued until the 1st of September. Mrs. W.M. Wright is convalescent from an ill turn, and Miss Ethel Richardson is assisting with household duties in the Wright home. The force of workmen who are to renovate and transform the interior of the old First Parish Church during the summer weeks started on Monday. They are being boarded at Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Blodgett's. The big boulder to be used for a marker for the new Whitney Park was brought Monday and has been placed since by the workmen. It was brought from the Hildreth Prospect Hill Farm and required 6 horses to pull it. And that boulder is still there with Whitney Park written on it. The next section is entitled Clipping. Anything concerning the progress and welfare of our young people who are in other places is always of interest. The following item is quoted from a paper in Centerville. Quote, "Our schools were closed last Friday at noon. The teacher, Mr. Reed, and Miss Cannell attending the teachers' meeting at the Hyannis Normal School. Miss Rose A. Hallett, our librarian, also attended this meeting, as all the town librarians were invited to meet and hear the able address of Miss Howard of Cotuit, an expert on the library question." Miss Howard was from the Howard family of Westford. This refers to our Miss Alice Howard, who took the librarian's course at Simmons College and who has assisted in our own library so acceptably. The next couple of paragraphs are entitled Runaways. Master Clifford Woods met with an accident on Monday, which the little fellow's many friends are thankful was no worse. With Albert and a third boy, a Perkins boy, he was returning from swimming at Burgess Pond, and while at Westford Depot, the horse took fright at the passing freight. The vehicle the boys were using had seen much service, and when the horse started to run, one of the wheels came off and Clifford got a bad fall. He hit on his head and was badly bruised and suffered much from nausea. After he was brought home, Dr. Wells was summoned. He fortunately found it not more than a bad shaking up and ordered some reduction of the young man's constant activity. Another runaway happened Monday, where there was plenty of possibility for a bad outcome. The workmen at the Whitney Park set off a blast after the noon hour when the horses had their bridles removed for their feeding. One pair of horses broke away and dashed into the street and started down Main Street. Between William Sutherland's and Samuel H. Balch's, they started to turn into the field, and in doing so, one of the horses fell. This stopped their run, and the men came quickly and got the horses up, thankful to find them unhurt. The next section is the About Town section. The next meeting of the Grange will be held Thursday evening, July 21st, when the following subject will be discussed. Quote, What is the cause of the high cost of living? End quote. Reverend and Mrs. Benjamin H. Bailey will spend their vacation with their daughter at Jamaica Plain, and the old First Parish Church will be closed until the first Sunday in September. Notice was given last Sunday by the parish committee for the removal of all books to the vestry, preparatory to extensive repairs on the interior of the church. The Honorable Herbert E. Fletcher and family have been enjoying forest and trout brook life in Vermont at Mrs. Fletcher's home. They have returned and are now, quote, doing, end quote, Maine. The contract for repairs on the Unitarian Church has been awarded to Perry Sons Company of Boston. Work has already commenced. It is estimated that about $1,000 will be expended. Next, we have the Forge Village section. A drowning accident was very narrowly averted in Forge Pond on Wednesday afternoon about 6 o'clock when Miss Sadie Smith with several companions were swimming. Miss Smith, who was anxious to learn how to swim, got out beyond her depth, and the wind, which was blowing quite strong, caused her to loosen her hold on the water wings. They floated away, and she sank from view twice. The third time, she threw up her hands. The other members began calling for help. Miss Nellie Burns swam to her assistance and brought her to shore, none the worse for her ducking, but badly frightened. The Forge Village Lions defeated the Richmonds of Lowell on the home ground on Saturday afternoon by the score of 8-6. Next Saturday, the Lions will cross bats with the North Chelmsford team at that place. And we're talking about baseball games here, of course. Reverend Mr. Gray of Nevada will have charge of St. Andrew's Parish until September. Services will be held at the Mission House next Sunday at 3:30 instead of 4:30 until further notice. You may recall that the pastor of St. Andrew's Church in Ayer had moved on, and Groton, in Ayer, had moved on to another parish, and he was also the pastor that took care of St. Andrew's mission here in Forge Village. Mr. and Mrs. Good of Westford are spending this week at their cottage at Forge Pond. William Myers of Boston is enjoying 2 weeks vacation as the guest of Joseph Bennett Sr. and family. Miss Ethel Jones of Worcester is enjoying her vacation at the home of her grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. William Burnett. She will also spend some time with her aunt, Mrs. Chester Blodgett, at the Ridges. William Hanley of Marlborough is visiting with his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Hanley. Miss Ellen Burns and Miss Alice Oldham have returned from a very enjoyable visit spent with friends in Newark, New Jersey. They also visited New York City, Coney Island, and Providence, Rhode Island. Since they visited Providence, I think there's a good chance that they took a boat down out of Providence down to New York City, but I don't know for sure. Miss Sarah Lefevre and sister have gone to Stanfold, Quebec, where they will spend the next 2 months with their parents. William Leahy, who has charge of the Gage Ice Houses, sprained the ligaments of his knee while at work on Monday. Patrick Fee of Cleveland, Ohio, was the weekend guest of Mr. and Mrs. McNiff at their home on Bradford Street. Mrs. Binns of South Barry and Mrs. Corcoran of Lowell are visiting with Mr. and Mrs. John McNiff. Mr. and Mrs. John Campling, her married name was Mary M. Whigham, and 6 children of Lawrence have returned home after a pleasant visit with her sisters, Mrs. Edmund Hunt and Mrs. William Hunt, at their farm. Miss Gladys Daly of Leominster has accepted a position as bookkeeper in the new store of Victor Pigeon. The 2 new cottages, which are being built on Lakeside, are nearly completed and will be ready for occupancy in a short time. Mr. and Mrs. Stewart of Everett are entertaining a party of friends at Tiny Coed. That's TINY-CO-ED. Many of the cottages on Forge Pond had names such as that. Miss Annie Walsh, who lost a roll of bills while on a shopping tour in Lowell a short time ago, was fortunate in having the money returned to her last week. The money was found by Miss Anna R. Cromie of Billerica, who was a trained nurse at the state hospital at Tewksbury. Wonder if that would happen today. That's the news in Westford for the week ending July 16th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of Westford Cat for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.